Most disturbing child deaths caused by mothers. Most of us grow up with the same unshakable belief. No matter what else is wrong in the world, your safest place is supposed to be your mother's arms. That's the one person you're told will step in front of anything, any threat, any danger before it ever reaches you. But what happens when the person everyone trusts to protect a child is the one quietly planning the harm? And mothers became the last faces their children ever saw. One drowned all 5 of her kids in a bathtub, convinced God was ordering her to save them from hell. One strapped her boys into their car seats, rolled the car into a lake, and cried on national TV while the country searched for a kidnapper who never existed. One partied for a month, entered a hot body contest, and got beautiful life inked on her skin while her toddler lay dead just half a mile from home. And one lived in a cramped apartment where a newborn's injuries were so bizarre that doctors had to ask a question nobody should ever have to ask. Did someone use a microwave as a weapon? But these aren't ghost stories, they're actual case files. And once you've heard what these mothers did and why, they will change the way you think about safe forever. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse, glorify, or condone any of the criminal actions or individuals described in this case. Viewer discretion is advised. Andrea Yates, 2001, Texas. She waited until her husband left for work, filled the bathtub, and one by one carried all 5 of her children into that small bathroom in suburban Houston. And by the time Rusty Yates got a phone call telling him to come home, every single one of them was already gone. But on paper, Andrea Yates didn't look like a monster at all. She'd been a nurse, a quiet, studious girl from Houston who married an engineer she met at work. And together they built what looked like the perfect large Christian family. 5 kids in 7 years, a modest home, Bible study, and a belief that they were doing exactly what God wanted, or so it seemed. They followed the teachings of a traveling street preacher who preached a harsh version of Christianity that talked constantly about sin, hell, and how women had to submit and raise godly children. Andrea absorbed that deeply, so when she became a stay-at-home mother in a cramped space with 5 young kids, she didn't see it as optional. She saw it as her entire purpose. The trouble was, her mind had already started to slip long before that June morning in 2001, and every pregnancy pushed her a little further over the edge. After the birth of their 4th child, she plunged into a severe depression. She stopped talking, she stopped eating, she scratched bald patches into her scalp, and one day she sat on the floor with a knife pressed to her own neck, telling Rusty she felt like she had nothing to live for. So he rushed her to the hospital where doctors diagnosed major depression with psychotic features. She was admitted more than once, placed on strong antipsychotic medication, and she later told psychiatrists she heard voices and saw disturbing images and thought something evil was inside her, telling her she was a terrible mother. One psychiatrist looked at her history and said very clearly that Andrea should not have any more children because the risk to her mental health was too high. But the Yates family believed children were a blessing from God, so they had one more baby anyway, a little girl named Mary. At the same time, they were living in tight conditions, and Andrea was homeschooling, cooking, cleaning, and caring for 5 children under the age of 7, with very little help, so every stressor that could exist in her life pretty much did. After Mary's birth, her mental health collapsed again. She became withdrawn and zombie-like. She would stare into space. She stopped engaging with the kids, and when her father died in early 2001, that loss pushed her further into a psychotic depression. She was admitted to hospital again. On her medication, she improved, but when the dosage was reduced or stopped, she deteriorated quickly, and she began to develop a fixed, terrifying idea that her children were going to hell and that it would be her fault unless she did something. One of the most disturbing details she later gave investigators was that this wasn't the first time she had prepared that bathtub. Weeks before the killings, she filled it up in the middle of the day, intending to drown the children, but she stopped herself and checked back into the hospital the next day, telling doctors she was feeling suicidal again. Her medication was adjusted, and for a short time she seemed a little better, but then a key drug was discontinued, and family members later said she was still deeply withdrawn and obsessed with religious guilt, even though a recent appointment note suggested she looked stable enough. So, on the morning of June 20th, 2001, in their house in the Clear Lake area of Houston, everything quietly lined up for the worst possible outcome. Rusty had been told in the past that Andrea shouldn't be left alone with all the kids for extended periods, so he arranged for his mother to come over and help about an hour after he left for work. He kissed the kids goodbye, assumed Andrea would be okay for that 1 hour, and walked out the door around 9 a.m. As soon as he left, Andrea went to the bathroom, turned on the tap, and started filling the bathtub. And in her mind, the decision she was making wasn't murder. It was, as she later described it, saving her children from a lifetime of spiritual corruption and eternal punishment. What happened next took minutes, but it rewrote all of their lives forever. Andrea carried the children to the bathroom one by one. According to what she later told doctors and police, she started with the 3 younger boys, bringing each child into the bathroom, holding them in the water until they stopped struggling, then laying their bodies on the bed. She then brought in Noah, her eldest, and some accounts suggest he realized something was horribly wrong and tried to run, but she caught him and held him under the water as well. Finally, she brought 6-month-old Mary into the tub and drowned her too, leaving the baby's body floating in the water while the 4 boys lay lifeless in the bedroom. When she was finished, she didn't run. She didn't pretend the children were still alive, and she didn't try to stage an accident. Instead, she picked up the phone and dialed 911.
You need an ambulance? No, I need a police officer. You have sent an ambulance.
Then hung up and called Rusty at work, telling him, "You need to come home." Officers who arrived at the house walked into a scene that didn't match the quiet street outside at all. They found 3 boys laid out on the bed, a 4th nearby, and baby Mary still in the bathtub, and Andrea quickly told them what she had done. She was arrested on the spot and taken into custody, and within about a day, she was sitting across from a psychiatrist in jail, calmly describing the killings and acknowledging that she knew killing the children was against the law. That one detail, that she understood it was illegal, would become a major weapon for the prosecution later, but at the same time, her explanation for why she did it left almost everyone who heard it stunned. In taped interviews and later in court, Andrea said she believed something evil was inside her, that she was a bad mother who was ruining her children, and that if they grew up under her care, they would be spiritually damaged and condemned. So in her psychotic logic, the only way to protect them was to end their lives while they were still innocent. A forensic psychiatrist who evaluated her for the defense later told the jury that in her mind, this was an altruistic killing, that in the distorted, delusional world she was living in, she truly thought she was doing the right thing to save their souls, even though she knew society and the law saw it as wrong. The state of Texas charged her with multiple counts of capital murder and, at first, pursued the death penalty, and her first trial in 2002 centered on one narrow legal question. Was she legally insane at the time of the killings according to Texas law, which required that she either did not know what she was doing or did not know it was wrong? The defense laid out her entire mental health history, hospitalizations, suicide attempts, psychosis, religious delusions, and argued she met that standard, while the prosecution focused on how she had waited for Rusty to leave, locked up the family dog so it couldn't interfere, filled the tub deliberately, and then called 911 and her husband afterward, using these steps to argue that she clearly understood what she was doing and knew it was wrong. In March 2002, the jury in her first trial rejected the insanity defense and found her guilty of capital murder. And although prosecutors had originally sought death, they settled for a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 40 years. In 2005, an appeals court overturned Andrea Yates' conviction, ruling that the false testimony about that TV episode was misleading and could have influenced the jury, and the case was sent back for a new trial. This time, in 2006, the prosecution didn't seek the death penalty, and the defense again emphasized her severe postpartum psychosis and religious delusions. The jury heard about her years of breakdowns, her aborted bathtub attempt in May, the warnings doctors had given, and the way her delusional belief system framed the drownings as a twisted kind of rescue. So, in July 2006, the second jury reached a very different conclusion. They found Andrea Yates not guilty by reason of insanity, and instead of sending her back to prison, the judge ordered her committed to a secure state mental hospital. She has been there ever since, and every year she has the option to request a hearing that could move her closer to release. But reports say she keeps declining, choosing to remain in treatment. Rusty, who had stood by her for years and publicly blamed the mental health system and the doctors more than his wife, eventually divorced her and later remarried. But he has said more than once that Andrea was desperately ill and that the system failed to protect both her and their children. But our next mother didn't have delusions or voices to blame. She had a boyfriend who didn't want kids, and a lie so convincing it had the entire country searching for a man who never existed. Susan Smith, 1994, South Carolina. On a cold October night in 1994, a young mother in Union, South Carolina, ran up to a stranger's house, banging on the door, screaming that a man had just stolen her car at a red light, with her 2 little boys still strapped in the back. She said a black man with a gun had jumped into her Mazda at an intersection, ordered her out, pushed her onto the pavement, and then drove off into the dark. And she kept repeating that her sons, 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alex, were still inside. So within hours, there were roadblocks, news bulletins, and a statewide alert for a missing car and 2 kidnapped children. For 9 days, America watched Susan Smith stand in front of TV cameras, crying and begging, "Whoever has my children, please bring them home." And it felt like the whole country was holding its breath for a carjacker who didn't exist. But Susan Smith's life before that night looked on the surface like small-town normal. She'd grown up in Union, worked at the local Conso products plant, married a coworker named David Smith, and had 2 sons in quick succession. But underneath that, she carried a long trail of trauma and instability that most people didn't see. When she was a teenager, her stepfather S.A. her, and years later he admitted to inappropriate sexual conduct, which left her with deep scars and a history of depression and suicide attempts. So by the time she was in her early 20s, she had already tried to end her life more than once. Her marriage to David was volatile. There were affairs, separations, and reconciliations, and during one of those off-again phases, she started seeing someone new. Tom Findlay, the son of a wealthy local businessman who owned the plant where she worked. Tom was everything the small-town girl with big insecurities might have idealized: handsome, educated, from money, and Susan latched onto that relationship as a way out of the chaos of her marriage. But there was a problem. He didn't want to be a stepfather. About a week before Michael and Alex disappeared, Tom gave Susan a letter that would later become a centerpiece of the trial. In it, he told her that he cared about her, but that there were things in her life that didn't fit where he saw his own future headed. And then he wrote the line that prosecutors would quote over and over. He said he did not want children. So, on October 25th, 1994, Susan strapped Michael and Alex into their car seats and drove out into the night, and according to her later confession, she spent a long time just driving aimlessly around Union County, thinking about killing herself, thinking about the boys, and thinking about a future that she believed she had already lost. Then she headed toward John D. Long Lake, a quiet spot a few miles outside town with a boat ramp that sloped straight down into the water. The story she told police that first night was that she had stopped at a red light on Highway 49, that a black man had approached the car, pulled a gun, ordered her out, pushed her aside, and sped away with the boys still inside. But even in those first hours, some of the details didn't make sense to investigators, because the intersection she described wasn't the kind of place where a lone car would sit long enough for a casual carjacking, and her timeline didn't match what they knew about the roads. Still, the department had to treat it as real, and so did the country. Susan and David appeared together at a press conference, holding hands, and Susan looked into the cameras and sobbed, "I can't sleep, I can't eat, I just want my babies back." And it was the kind of raw plea that cuts straight through people's defenses. So donations and tips poured in while volunteers searched woods, fields, and highway shoulders. But back at the station, detectives did what good detectives always do. They brought her in again and again, walked through her story step by step, and each time they noticed small shifts in what she said. A slightly different route, a slightly different description of how she fell to the ground. A slightly different timing of when the supposed carjacker appeared. They asked her to ride with them and physically retrace her route from that night. And in the car, when she tried to demonstrate where she'd stopped and how the man had gotten in, those little inconsistencies got bigger, and the officers watching her started to believe that nothing about this kidnapping had ever happened. While all that was going on, they were also learning more about her private life. They found Tom's letter, and they learned that on the very day the boys disappeared, Susan had made contact with him. He testified later that she tried to give his sweatshirt back and told him, "I may not see you again," which he took as a suicidal warning, and he said he was worried she might hurt herself, but never suspected she might hurt the children. Between that, her history of suicide attempts, and the fact that there were no witnesses and no physical evidence of a carjacker, the investigators slowly shifted from hunting for a stranger to circling around the mother who kept putting herself on TV. On November 3rd, 9 days after the supposed kidnapping, they decided to confront her directly. That afternoon, they met Susan at a local church office rather than the police station, hoping the setting would feel less intimidating. And they told her they knew the story she'd been telling could not be true. One of the lead investigators later recalled looking her in the eye and saying something along the lines of, "Susan, it's time to tell us where the boys are." And that was the moment she cracked. She started to cry and said, "You don't understand. My children are not all right." Then she sat down and wrote out a 2-page confession in her own hand, signing and dating it around 5 p.m. In that statement, she said she had been emotionally distraught, that she felt like a failure as a mother and as a woman, and that she believed she couldn't be the kind of partner Tom wanted because of her boys. So on the night of October 25th, she had not been carjacked at all. She admitted she had driven alone to John D. Long Lake, parked at the top of the boat ramp, left Michael and Alex strapped into their car seats, put the car in neutral, stepped out, and let it roll slowly into the black water while she stood and watched the taillights disappear. In one of the most haunting lines from that confession, she wrote that she had thought about killing herself too, but that I didn't want my children to grow up without a mom. So she decided the 3 of them would die together, but at the last second she stepped away and let only the car go. That night, divers from the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources went into the lake and quickly located the Mazda upside down in about 18 feet of water. When they pulled it up, both boys were still inside, strapped into their seats exactly how she had described. For the town of Union, and for the millions of people who had watched her cry on national television, the shift from desperate victim to confessed killer was whiplash. The composite sketch of the imaginary black carjacker went from being a focal point of fear to a symbol of how easily a racial stereotype could be weaponized, and people who had volunteered their time to search felt used and betrayed. The legal system moved fast. In December 1994, a grand jury indicted Susan on 2 counts of murder, and the local solicitor, Tommy Pope, announced that he would seek the death penalty, arguing that rolling a car into a lake with 2 small children inside and then lying about it for 9 days met the standard for the ultimate punishment.
Of any other steps that I could take, there's been an investigation.
Evidence, and that evidence is more abundant now than it was on January 27th, that unless action is taken before trial, Susan Smith will not receive a fair trial from this court.
I will tell you, this matter, what I don't want this to become is a means by Mr. Bruck of, in essence, circumventing the very order that you've laid down by bringing it into the courtroom while the media is present and going through his list. I would note on the various motions he makes, he goes well beyond what's needed to set forth the motion, just in essence to put more propaganda out. And I would
Call your first witness.
I think I've disinvited.
Her trial began in the summer of 1995, and the prosecution built a narrative that tied everything together: the stepfather's abuse, the rocky marriage, the affair with Tom Findlay, the letter that said, "I don't want children," and the calculated decision to remove the boys from her life so she could pursue a relationship without them. They played tapes of her sobbing on camera, then juxtaposed those clips with the confession and the cool, methodical description of how she walked away from the sinking car, and they called David Smith to the stand to talk about his grief and his belief that a life sentence with the chance of parole after 30 years simply wasn't enough. But the defense didn't claim she was innocent. They admitted she had killed Michael and Alex, but they tried to convince the jury that she was not a monster in the way the prosecution painted her, that she was a deeply disturbed suicidal woman whose judgment had been warped by years of trauma and untreated mental illness. They talked about her teenage abuse, the chaos of her marriage, her chronic depression, and her desperate state of mind in those days of driving around and thinking about ending her life. And they argued that while those things did not excuse what she did, they should spare her from execution. Even Susan herself, when she spoke, leaned on that language of being not in my right mind, and said she never truly intended to hurt her boys in the way it looked from the outside. It took the jury a little over 2 hours to find her guilty of murdering both children, and then they had to decide whether she would live or die. In the sentencing phase, Pope pushed hard for death, reminding jurors of the slow descent of that car and the 9 days of lies and racial scapegoating that followed. But the defense's picture of a broken, mentally ill young woman carried enough weight that the jury stepped back from the edge. They sentenced Susan Smith to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. She has spent those decades at Leith Correctional Institution in Greenwood, South Carolina, and life behind bars has not turned into a neat redemption arc. Prison records show multiple disciplinary issues over the years: drug use, self-harm, and sexual relationships with 2 different guards, both of whom were prosecuted and lost their jobs. And every time she has come back into the news, usually tied to those incidents or to upcoming parole dates, the same question comes up: has anything really changed? In November 2024, exactly 30 years after her arrest, she appeared by video before the South Carolina Parole Board for the first time, crying as she said, "I know what I did was horrible, and I would give anything if I could go back and change it. I love Michael and Alex with all my heart." And she asked the board to show her the same mercy she believed God had shown her. David Smith, their father, sat on the other side of that process and told the board he would be there every 2 years for as long as he had to be to make sure his sons were not forgotten and to argue that the woman who sent them to the bottom of that lake should never walk free. The board unanimously denied her first request for parole, and she remains in prison today, eligible to ask again every 2 years, but with a long record of misconduct working against her. And that is why, 3 decades later, Susan Smith's case still grips people, not only because of the horror of a mother letting a car roll into the water with 2 babies inside, but because of the 9 days she spent looking into the camera and lying, the way she weaponized a racial stereotype to cover herself, and the lingering fear that for someone capable of that level of deception, true remorse might be just another performance. And if you're still here listening to this, you're our kind of viewer. Click like and subscribe so you're here for the next story. Susan spun a lie about a stranger with a gun and a car sinking in the dark, but at least she admitted what she'd done in the end. Our next mother never did. She went clubbing for 31 days, got a beautiful life tattoo, and when her 2-year-old vanished, she didn't blame a carjacker, she blamed a nanny who didn't exist. Casey Anthony. For 31 days, while her 2-year-old daughter was missing, Casey Anthony entered a hot body contest at a nightclub, got a tattoo that said Bella Vita, beautiful life, in Italian, and moved in with her boyfriend without telling a single person that her little girl was gone. And when she was finally confronted, she didn't confess, she invented a babysitter. Casey Anthony grew up in Orlando, Florida, the second child of George Anthony, a former police officer, and Cindy Anthony, a registered nurse. And on the surface, the family looked stable enough: a modest house, 2 working parents, a quiet suburban neighborhood. But underneath, there were fault lines that would eventually crack everything open. Casey had a complicated, combustible relationship with her mother Cindy from her teenage years onward, and she developed a habit of compulsive lying so ingrained that people who knew her well said she could look you in the eye and tell you something completely false without blinking. She never finished high school, drifted between part-time jobs, and in 2005, at 19 years old, she gave birth to a daughter she named Kaylee Marie Anthony, and she never definitively identified who the father was, telling different people different stories, depending on what suited her at the time. After Kaylee was born, Casey continued living with her parents on Hope Spring Drive in Orlando, and it was largely George and Cindy who took on the day-to-day responsibility of caring for Kaylee while Casey came and went, spending time with friends and a rotating cast of boyfriends. Cindy adored Kaylee fiercely and grew increasingly frustrated watching her daughter treat motherhood as an inconvenience, and family members later described a household full of tension, arguments, and a growing sense that Cindy was the one holding everything together while Casey looked for the exit. Then, on the morning of June 16, 2008, George Anthony said goodbye to his granddaughter at the front door. Kaylee was wearing a pink top and carrying her little backpack. Casey was driving her somewhere, and George kissed Kaylee and told her he loved her. and that was the last time anyone in that family ever saw her alive. After that morning, Casey vanished into a parallel life. She moved into the apartment of her boyfriend, Tony Lazaro, told him and everyone else that Kaylee was with a babysitter or at her parents' house, and proceeded to spend the next month acting, by every observable measure, as though nothing had happened and no child existed. Surveillance footage captured her grocery shopping. Photos circulated of her at Fusion Ultra Lounge, dancing and laughing. And on one of those nights, she entered a hot body contest. 4 days after Kaylee was last seen alive, she went to Blockbuster with Tony to rent movies. A few days after that, she borrowed a shovel from a neighbor, and somewhere in all of that, she walked into a tattoo parlor and had Bella Vita permanently inked onto her shoulder, Beautiful Life, which prosecutors would later point to as one of the most telling details in the entire case. For the whole 31 days, Cindy called repeatedly trying to reach Kaylee, and Casey kept deflecting. The baby was asleep, she was out with the nanny, they were traveling, and when Cindy pushed harder, Casey pushed back with irritation. And so a month went by before Cindy finally forced a confrontation on July 15, 2008. What had already unraveled things was the car. George had retrieved Casey's 1998 white Pontiac from an impound lot where it had been towed after sitting abandoned outside a check cashing facility. And the moment he opened the trunk, he was hit by a smell so powerful that he later told investigators he immediately thought it meant something terrible had happened. The smell of human decomposition is something most people never encounter, but George had worked in law enforcement and he said he knew what it was. Cindy tracked Casey down, brought her home, and the call she made to 911 that evening told the whole story in real time. In one call, Cindy told the dispatcher that Kaylee had been missing for 31 days, and in another she said, "It smells like there's been a dead body in the damn car." Casey, in the background of those calls, could be heard arguing rather than crying.
3-year-old little girl. My daughter finally admitted that the baby's in the store. I need to find her.
Your daughter admitted that the baby is where?
But the babysitter took her a month ago that my daughter's been looking for. I told you my daughter was missing for a month. I just found her today, but I can't find my granddaughter. She just admitted to me that she's been trying to find her herself. There's something wrong. I found my daughter's car today, and it smells like there's been a dead body in the...
When police arrived and started asking questions, Casey told them she had last dropped Kaylee off on June 9th with her babysitter, a woman named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, Zanny the nanny, at an apartment complex called Sawgrass, and that Zanny had never returned her. The next day, she led detectives to that apartment complex, where records showed no one by that name had ever lived, and then she led them to Universal Studios, where she claimed to work as an event coordinator, walking them confidently through the building until she abruptly stopped in a hallway and admitted that she hadn't actually worked there in over 2 years. Investigators pulled her into a room on the spot, and the story started to unravel even faster. She was arrested on July 16th on charges of child neglect and providing false statements, and investigators began the slow process of building a case around a child they hadn't yet found. The forensic evidence from the car became critical almost immediately. Cadaver dogs alerted on the trunk. A strand of hair found inside was microscopically consistent with Kaylee's and showed characteristics associated with decomposition, and air samples from the trunk tested positive for chemical compounds consistent with human decomposition. Then came the computer evidence. Forensic investigators found deleted searches on the Anthony family laptop from March 2008, months before the disappearance, that included the terms chloroform, how to make chloroform, neck breaking, and self-defense. Prosecutors argued those searches proved premeditation, that Casey had been researching ways to incapacitate or kill long before June, and their theory was that she had used chloroform to sedate Kaylee and then suffocated her with duct tape so she could live the free, unencumbered life she wanted with no child in the way. But at trial, Cindy Anthony took the stand and testified that she herself had made those chloroform searches because she was worried about a plant in the garden, but computer records indicated she had been at work during some of the times those searches were made, which left that testimony in serious doubt for a lot of observers. On October 14, 2008, before Kaylee had even been found, a Florida grand jury indicted Casey Anthony on first-degree murder, aggravated CA, aggravated manslaughter, and 4 counts of lying to law enforcement with the death penalty on the table. Then, 2 months later, on December 11, 2008, a utility worker named Roy Kronk was clearing a wooded area on Suburban Drive, less than half a mile from the Anthony family home, and discovered a laundry bag containing skeletal remains. The medical examiner identified them as Kaylee Marie Anthony, 2 years old. Found with the remains were duct tape in a position consistent with having been placed over the mouth and nose, a colorful blanket from the Anthony home, a Winnie the Pooh backpack, and a trash bag, and the manner of death was ruled a homicide. The cause could not be determined definitively because the body had been so badly decomposed, and that gap would later become the most important crack in the prosecution's case. So, Casey's murder trial began on May 24, 2011, in Orlando, and it became one of the most watched and talked about trials of the entire decade. The prosecution painted a clear picture. Casey killed Kaylee to free herself from motherhood using chloroform and duct tape, then disposed of the body half a mile from her own house and spent a month pretending her daughter was alive. The 31 days of photos, the hot body contest, the Bella Vita tattoo, the borrowed shovel, the abandoned car with its unmistakable smell. Prosecutors put all of it in front of the jury as a mosaic of guilt, but the defense attorney, Jose Baez, opened with something nobody expected. He told the jury that Kaylee had not been murdered at all, that on the morning of June 16th, Kaylee had accidentally drowned in the family's above-ground swimming pool, that George Anthony had discovered the body, and that instead of calling 911, he had disposed of the remains himself to avoid scrutiny and had then threatened Casey into silence, telling her if she said anything, she would lose everything. Baez alleged that Casey's entire life of compulsive lying was a coping mechanism she had developed because her father had SA her since she was 8 years old, and that her strange, disconnected behavior during those 31 days was the reaction of a woman in a trauma response, not a murderer celebrating her freedom. But George Anthony took the stand, denied every single allegation with visible emotion, and denied any involvement in Kaylee's death or the disposal of her body. However, on July 5, 2011, after deliberating for approximately 10 hours, the jury found Casey Anthony not guilty of first-degree murder, not guilty of aggravated manslaughter, and not guilty of aggravated CA. She was convicted on 4 misdemeanor counts of lying to law enforcement. The reaction outside the courthouse was immediate and visceral. Crowds who had gathered burst into tears and screaming. People held signs with Kaylee's face. And within hours, social media was flooded with a level of public fury that legal commentators described as unprecedented for a criminal verdict. Many legal analysts concluded the prosecution had overcharged the case and that the inability to establish a definitive cause of death had made it impossible to meet the burden of proof beyond reasonable doubt. But for millions of people watching, the acquittal felt like a failure of the entire justice system. 2 days after sentencing on July 7, 2011, where she received 4 years and a $4,000 fine for the lying charges, but was credited for time already served, Casey Anthony walked out of Orange County Jail in the early morning hours and disappeared. The state chose not to list her in the parolee database because of the volume of death threats she had received, but in 2022, she resurfaced for a documentary series and gave her first on-camera interview in over a decade, in which she admitted that the nanny story was completely fabricated, acknowledged that she had lied compulsively throughout the investigation, but placed all responsibility for Kaylee's death on her father, claiming he staged the drowning and forced her to stay silent. George denied it. No one has ever been convicted of Kaylee Anthony's death, and her case remains legally unsolved. A 2-year-old girl whose remains were found less than half a mile from her grandmother's house, whose mother partied for 31 days while she lay in those woods, and whose killer, according to a jury of 12, was never proven in a court of law. So when you look at 31 days of lies, partying, and a child found half a mile from home, do you think the verdict was accurate, or did the system fail Kaylee Anthony? Casey's story ended with a not guilty verdict and a child whose death no one has ever legally answered for. But our next mother didn't have a road, or a gun, or even a story that made sense. Just a cramped apartment, a drunken fight over paternity, and a kitchen appliance no one ever imagined could become a weapon. China Arnold, 2005, Ohio. In the early hours of August 30, 2005, doctors in Dayton, Ohio were handed a 28-day-old baby whose injuries made no medical sense at all, and within hours those injuries would lead detectives to one of the most disturbing methods of killing they had ever seen. The baby's name was Paris Talley. Her mother, 25-year-old China Arnold, walked into Children's Medical Center carrying her in her arms. And from the moment staff took Paris, they knew they were in a fight they were probably going to lose. Paris had no pulse, no breathing, and no blood pressure, so the team started working on her. But even as they tried to resuscitate her, they noticed that her body told a very strange story. There were no obvious burns on her skin, her little pink outfit looked mostly intact, but internally, her organs were badly damaged in a way they'd never really seen in a child that age. They worked on her for about 15 minutes before pronouncing her dead, and afterward, as they examined her more closely and documented the injuries, they realized they were looking at signs of something like intense, focused heat from the inside out, not an open flame or hot water from the outside in. But while all of that was happening in the emergency room, China was out in the waiting area with her boyfriend, Paris's father, a man named Terrell Talley, and when nurses asked what had happened, the story she told was simple on the surface. She said she'd come home late that night, tried to feed Paris, noticed the baby felt hot, and decided to put her down in a bassinet with a fan blowing on her while she took a nap. She said when she woke up in the morning, Paris wasn't acting right. So they got their older kids ready for school, sent them off on the bus, and then drove the baby to the hospital. So if you take that version at face value, you've got a mother who thinks her baby has a fever, tries some home comfort, and then seeks help when it gets worse. But the doctors looking at Paris's body knew right away that a fever did not explain what they were seeing, and that gap between the explanation and the evidence was what kicked off a homicide investigation. The Montgomery County Coroner's Office performed the autopsy, and the findings were shocking even to seasoned forensic pathologists. Paris had catastrophic thermal injuries to her internal organs. Her liver, stomach, and other tissues showed signs of being superheated, while the outside of her body and most of her clothing were not charred or scalded the way you'd expect from hot water, open flame, or a space heater. Instead, the damage was consistent with exposure to powerful microwave energy, the kind you get inside a kitchen microwave oven. That conclusion was so unusual that when it was shared with detectives, they had to step back and ask themselves a question nobody ever expects to ask in a child death. Could somebody have actually put this baby in a microwave? So the detectives went to the family's place, a ground floor unit in the Parkside Homes public housing complex in Dayton. In that little apartment, they found a standard microwave oven in the kitchen. And the more they looked around, the more the scene lined up with the autopsy instead of with the sick baby story. Paris's onesie, which should have been covered in some kind of debris if there had been a traditional mechanical accident, looked too intact for the level of internal damage the coroner was describing. In the bathroom, they found a plastic tub filled with water and floating bits of translucent material that looked like skin, as if someone had tried to rinse or cool parts of the baby's body after the fact. Neighbors told police that earlier that night they had heard loud arguing coming from the apartment, and that China and Terrell had been drinking heavily. And when detectives started asking questions about what the fight was about, they heard the same thing more than once, that Terrell had questioned whether he was really Paris's biological father. That paternity argument became central to understanding what might have happened in the hours before that hospital visit. According to later testimony, China and Terrell had gone out drinking on August 29th, came back to the apartment drunk, and got into a heated fight about whether Paris was really his child. At some point, neighbors saw him leave the complex in anger, while China went back inside with the children. So you have alcohol, jealousy, an argument over paternity, and a mother left alone with a baby who, 4 or 5 hours later, would be dead from injuries that pointed straight at an appliance sitting in her own kitchen. When detectives brought China back in after the autopsy report, they didn't tell her everything they knew right away. Instead, they asked her to walk them through the night again, and what they watched for were the shifts. At the hospital, she'd said she got home around 2 a.m., tried to feed Paris, noticed she was hot, and set up the fan, but in a later police interview, she moved the arrival time earlier to sometime between 9 and 10 p.m., and said she'd fallen asleep with Paris lying on her chest on the couch. In another version, she added that she got up around 2:30 a.m. to warm a bottle because Paris had started crying. Each time she retold it, little details changed. When Terrell left, how long Paris had been crying, exactly when she checked on the baby, and those tweaks made detectives think she was trying to patch holes rather than just remembering. By 2006, the state felt it had enough to charge her. Prosecutors indicted China Arnold on aggravated murder, and in February 2008, her first trial began. In front of a Dayton jury, the state laid out the medical evidence. A 28-day-old infant with internal burns so precise and so severe that the only scientifically supported explanation was that she had been placed in a microwave and exposed to its energy for somewhere around 2 minutes. They called experts who explained how microwave radiation heats water molecules in tissue from the inside out, and how that could kill a baby with little to no external burns. They showed the jury the layout of the apartment, the location of the microwave, and the inconsistencies in China's statements. They also called a key witness, Linda Williams, a woman who had been housed with China in jail, who said China had confided in her that she had put Paris in the microwave after fighting with Terrell, and that she had been drunk at the time. But the first trial didn't reach a verdict, because right at the point where the state thought it was closing in, the defense introduced a curveball. A 5-year-old boy who said he had seen another child in the apartment put the baby in the microwave. The idea was that one of the other kids, playing unsupervised, might have done it, and that the blame for the death had been wrongly laid on China. Because that statement came in late and raised new factual questions, the judge declared a mistrial in February 2008, essentially hitting reset on the process. The second trial later that year followed much the same path. The state argued that no small child could have carried Paris, opened the microwave, placed her inside, closed the door, and started it, and that the physical sequence required focus and intent, not an accident. The defense tried to flesh out the alternate stories, suggesting either that another child had been involved or that Terrell might have had more responsibility than he admitted. The mother of the boy who claimed to have seen another child do it, however, testified that her boyfriend, the man supposedly connected to that scenario, was not even at the complex when Paris died, undercutting that narrative. In September 2008, that second jury convicted China of aggravated murder, and the judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. However, this case refused to stay closed. In 2010, the Ohio 2nd District Court of Appeals overturned that conviction, ruling that the trial judge had improperly blocked defense witnesses and that some of the prosecution's conduct had prejudiced the jury. So China Arnold's conviction was vacated and the case was sent back for yet another trial. For the third time, prosecutors had to sit down, organize every piece of evidence, and persuade 12 new jurors that they were looking at an intentional, calculated killing carried out with a microwave. The third trial took place in May 2011, and by then, the narrative was brutally focused. Assistant prosecutor Dan Brandt stood up in closing arguments and told the jury that using a microwave was, in some ways, even more deliberate than using a gun, because this wasn't a single trigger pull in a moment of passion. This was a series of steps. A person picked up a 28-day-old infant, carried her to an appliance, put her inside, closed the door, pushed buttons, and then waited while the machine ran. If that isn't purposeful, he asked them, what is? The state again called Linda Williams, who repeated that China had told her she'd put Paris in the microwave after a fight about paternity. The defense pressed the idea that there were others in and around the apartment that night and that the forensic evidence couldn't say whose hands had done what, but they were up against a mountain of circumstantial proof that all pointed back to the one adult who had both the opportunity and the motive. On May 13, 2011, the jury returned a guilty verdict on the aggravated murder charge. A week later, in the penalty phase, they chose not to recommend the death penalty, and on May 20th, the judge sentenced China Arnold to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He told her she would spend the rest of her life in an Ohio prison for what had been done to Paris. Since then, China has been moved between facilities like the Ohio Reformatory for Women, and she has continued to maintain that she is innocent, filing appeals that courts have repeatedly denied. Paris's father, Terrell, has tried to build a life around the hole left by his daughter's death, and he has spoken about how surreal it was to learn that the injuries the doctors had described came from an appliance he'd used to heat food, not from some freak accident. Forensic textbooks and training courses still refer to Paris's case because of the almost unheard-of mechanism of injury. Many pathologists will go their whole careers without seeing anything like it. And when people hear the phrase microwaved baby, it sounds like an urban legend. But in Dayton in 2005, it was a real crime scene, with a real mother, a real kitchen, and a real 28-day-old girl who never had a chance to do anything but cry. So, as disturbing as it is to even talk about, this case forces the question. In that tiny window of time between the end of an argument and the press of a start button, what has to break inside someone for their own newborn to become the target of that kind of revenge? And do you think life without parole was enough for what happened to Paris Talley? And that brings us to the end of these cases. What are your thoughts on them? Let us know in the comments. If this story shook you, there's more on the channel that dives into cases just as haunting. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button, and share this video. It helps keep these stories from being forgotten. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.